Today's video is brought to you by Athletic Greens and its wonderful daily blend of vitamins and minerals. AG1 by Athletic Greens is a comprehensive all-in-one greens powder engineered to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet and support your body's nutritional needs across 4 pillars of health: gut health, immune support, energy, and recovery. It's packed with 75 vitamins and minerals and whole food sourced ingredients, combining the perfect amount of micronutrients, absorption, and taste to jumpstart your daily routine. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more comprehensive powder/supplement on the market right now. Now, as you guys know, I'm not exactly a fitness YouTuber, but I do like to eat right and take care of myself. I also know I don't always eat right, so AG1 definitely fills those gaps for me. What you do is you take 1 scoop from the provided jar, you put it in the provided bottle, and I take it in the morning. I do it with my coffee, and it tastes great. But somehow tastes healthy at the same time. And I just feel it gives me a bit of a sustained boost of energy throughout the day, which is nice. Plus, AG1 is gluten-free, dairy-free, paleo, vegan, keto, low allergen, and low calorie, less than 1 gram of sugar per serving. AG1 is the perfect dietary support regimen, so if this sounds like the supplement that you've been looking for, then you can grab your own immunity bundle, which contains 1 year's supply of vitamin D plus 5 individual travel packs for free with your first purchase at athleticgreens.com/biographics. Again, year's supply of vitamin D, 5 travel packs for free at athleticgreens.com/biographics, or just click the link in the description below. And now, today's video. It was an era of hope that soon descended into agony. In 1960, Belgian Congo was at the head of a wave of decolonization sweeping Africa. After generations of exploitation, this gigantic nation, larger than Alaska and California combined, was free of the yoke of European rule, determined to forge its own destiny. For a handful of months, that shining future looked to be within reach. But then it slipped through everyone's fingers. Instead, the Congo found itself being squeezed lifeless in the iron grip of a brutal dictator, a leader more corrupt than nearly any other in his era. His name was Mobutu Sese Seko, and he would single-handedly crush his nation's dreams. A former journalist turned army officer, Mobutu had started out as one of the good guys, friends with Patrice Lumumba, an advocate for independence, a firm believer in helping the people. How he got from there to the depths of kleptocracy is a tale of hubris and tragedy, a tale that Biographics is exploring today. On the depressing top 10 list of nations you definitely don't want to get colonized by, the number 1 spot surely goes to Belgium. In 1876, King Leopold II took a gigantic swath of Africa as his own personal property, turning its lush forests into the heart of darkness. Decades of enslavement, murder, and mutilation followed as the Belgian king pillaged the land. Although his own government eventually stripped him of his possession in 1908, the damage had already been done. It was into this wounded, brutalized place that Mobutu Sese Seko would be born. Coming into the world on 14th of October 1930, Joseph Desire Mobutu, as he was originally known, started his life weighed down by disadvantages. For one thing, he was born out of wedlock, an unexpected son barely acknowledged by his father. For another, he grew up in what can only be described as the arse end of nowhere, a village so remote that it didn't even appear on maps. Yet his greatest disadvantage was something far more intrinsic. Mobutu, you see, was born black in a place that was still under Europe's thumb. The Belgian Congo that had replaced Leopold's atrocity exhibition may have been a step up from the king's regime, but it was still racist as hell. All the good jobs, all the important postings were held by whites. Despite this being their native land, locals could only dream of shattering that bulletproof glass ceiling. But while this shameful setup would ignite a fire in guys like Patrice Lumumba, a desire to fight for independence, Mobutu's way of dealing with it was more nuanced. For the first 30 years of his life, Mobutu would be very much in the if you can't beat 'em, join 'em camp. Thanks to a French education at the hands of Belgian missionaries, the young man was eventually able to leave his remote village and travel to the capital, Leopoldville. There, he began a career in colonial service, joining the Force Publique and rising to the rank of sergeant, one of the highest ranks available to black people. But it would be his parallel career as a journalist that really made him interesting to the Belgians. While working as a reporter in Leopoldville, Mobutu made contact with the the pro-independence movement. By now, it was the mid-1950s, and no one could ignore the wave of decolonization sweeping the world. In Belgian Congo, the guy riding the crest of this wave was Patrice Lumumba, a firebrand left-wing nationalist who was pretty sure the Congolese could rule themselves more effectively than dudes who thought mayonnaise with fries was a legitimate snack food. As he reported on him, Mobutu got to know Lumumba better than almost anyone. He even joined the older man's Congolese national movement, a pretty radical step at the time. Yet there's some suspicion today that Mobutu was not quite as radical as he seemed. In 1959, the young man travelled to Belgium to study journalism in Brussels at roughly the same time that negotiations were taking place on decolonization. Standing in for Lumumba when the activist was briefly jailed, it's thought Mobutu may have been passing information behind the scenes to Belgian intelligence, an asset for the colonials even as he was publicly pushing the cause of independence. If that was the case though, it didn't do authorities in Brussels much good. That same year, pro-independence riots paralysed Leopoldville, suddenly faced with the prospect of a colony 77 times their size becoming ungovernable. The Belgians decided to run for the exit. On June 30th, 1960, Belgian Congo ceased to exist, becoming the independent nation of the Republic of the Congo, a name which quickly had the word democratic tacked on the front to avoid confusion with its identically named northern neighbour. With the transfer of power, Patrice Lumumba was elevated to premier, with his political rival Joseph Kasavubu serving as president. More importantly for today's story, though, Mobutu likewise entered government, taking the post of Secretary of State for National Defence, in effect, giving him command of the army. Little could Lumumba or Kasavubu have known it, but this well-spoken journalist would soon turn out to be the worst person for the job imaginable. Although it might have been independent, the word stable would not have been anyone's choice to describe Congo in 1960. Just days after colonial rule ended, a mutiny broke out in the army against the white officers, one Mobutu only managed to put down through the hasty distribution of bribes. Around the same time, a civil war erupted as the wealthy province of Katanga tried to split off under leader Moise Tshombe and form an independent state. On top of that, Lumumba and Kasavubu began fighting for control of the government, a power struggle that threatened to destabilize the entire region. Into this rapidly developing dumpster fire came the geopolitical gas canister known as the CIA. 1960, of course, was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just 2 years away, and shady government types in suits were super jumpy about the idea of the Soviet Union picking up allies anywhere in the world. So when the leftist Lumumba asked Moscow for help putting down a rebellion in Katanga, it was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. To this day, many suspect the CIA's weapon of choice was Mobutu. By September 1960, the former journalist held perhaps one of the only solid power bases in the country, an army paid with donated American money. On the 14th, Mobutu used that armed power base to launch a coup, removing both Lumumba and Kasavubu from their posts. But only one of them would feel the full force of Mobutu's wrath. After a long standoff at a UN compound, Lumumba was captured, trying to escape on November the 27th. Beaten, tortured, the independence leader was at last flown to Katanga and given as a gift to Moise Tshombe. The rebel commander made sure he was never seen again. While this was the end of Lumumba, though, it wasn't quite the end of a semi-democratic Congo. With Lumumba dead and the Soviet threat neutralized, Mobutu stepped back from his coup. Kasavubu returns as civilian leader, and the army man slunk back to his base. Apparently, one of the reasons was the CIA's unwillingness to back a strong man that it regarded as weak. With his refined tastes, bookish air, and habit of indecision, Mobutu just wasn't a guy anyone could see dictating anything. One American diplomat derided him as a black Hamlet, after the Shakespearean character who famously spends 5 acts doing nothing. But that's the thing about dictators. They come in all sorts of flavors. While some, like Adolf Hitler, are clearly megalomaniacs by the time they reach power, others only show their true colors when it's too late to stop them. The next couple of years passed in a series of rolling crises. With Western backing, the government was able to reintegrate Katanga, with Moise Tshombe even going on to become the Congo's prime minister. But this just caused more problems as Kasavubu started clashing with the new guy just as it clashed with Lumumba. By 1965, their feud had become so bitter that the government was effectively paralyzed. It was at this point that Mobutu pulled off his real coup. On November the 24th, 1965, the army announced that democracy had been suspended and all power temporarily vested in Mobutu's hands. Thanks to the coup's echoes of 1960, everyone was all like, okay, I guess we don't really need to worry, he gave us power back last time. Right? But Mobutu's 1965 takeover would be nothing like the last time. In the aftermath of his seizure of power, Mobutu had Kasavubu placed under house arrest and Tshombe sent into exile. They both died in mysterious circumstances not long after. By then, though, it was clear what was happening. Blaming partisanship for Congo's crisis, Mobutu banned rival political factions, replacing the various parties with just one, the Popular Movement of the Revolution. Membership became mandatory, as was voting for it. So when Mobutu called a democratic election to decide his next move, the results were inevitable. Of all 20 million citizens, only 157 cast ballots against the party, itself a surprisingly large number given there was literally no one else to vote for. Just like that, the era of democracy in the Democratic Republic of the Congo was over. With executive functions still suspended and the nation now a one-party state, the ex-journalist at the head of it was suddenly free to do whatever he wanted. And what Mobutu wanted was to build one of the nastiest, most flagrantly corrupt dictatorships in all of history. Sometimes when we do these dictator videos, it can be hard to ascertain the exact moment they went from in it for the people to in it for themselves, plus also tons of insanity. However, there exists no such grey area where Mobutu Sese Seko is concerned. As far as we can tell, he stepped onto the leadership stage determined to act like a megalomaniacal tyrant. The tyrant part became incredibly obvious incredibly quickly. Mere months after taking power, Mobutu had 4 government ministers hanged in a sports stadium in front of 50,000 people. While that's not so shocking for the guy who willingly handed his old friend Lumumba over for a torture and murder session, it did mark a brutal new step in Congolese governance. One that would get more brutal as time went on, and torture and sexual violence became tools of oppression. Nor was the oppression merely physical. Like most dictators, Mobutu was super keen for all his subjects to think and act as he wanted them to. In his case, that meant forcing everyone to accept his ideology of authenticity. When you just skim the basics, authenticity sounds kind of interesting, arguing, as it did, against simply recreating European systems in the post-colonial era and instead looking to a political heritage that was truly African. But then you read what Mobutu defined as European, and you realize it was mostly just another excuse for keeping himself in power. According to authenticity, democracy was inherently European, and an African society should revolve around a powerful chief, with the chief's own ostentatious wealth and power the sole way of measuring the nation's health. So, while for common folk authenticity meant being banned from listening to foreign music, straightening their hair, or using Christian names, for Mobutu it meant a literal blank check. In his decades of rule, the Congolese dictator signed over so much of his nation's wealth to his own pocket that by some counts he was the most corrupt kleptocrat in history. Now, such rankings are always a little dubious, and there are other contenders like Suharto or Ferdinand Marcos. But to give you an idea of the eye-watering embezzlement that Mobutu was up to, here are just a few of the things that he blew ungodly sums on. Always a man of refined taste, even in his journalist days, Mobutu as dictator dedicated himself to collecting expensive trophies. That meant a string of mansions around the world and Concorde jets at his beck and call to take him on shopping trips at the drop of a leopard skin hat. Nor did he just use chartered planes to transport people. In one particularly memorable episode, the dictator decided he wanted to start keeping sheep on his ranch. Uninterested in European breeds, he ordered one of his jets to make 32 round trips to Caracas until as many as 5,000 Venezuelan sheep had been brought across the Atlantic. Ostentatious as all of this was, though, it paled beside Gbadolite. Mobutu's ancestral home, Gbadolite, had been an invisible village when he was born, a place colonial authorities didn't even bother including on maps of the wild northern regions. But that wasn't auspicious enough for Mobutu's tastes. So he had the whole town torn down and rebuilt. Only now the mud huts became marble villas, the local mission a luxury 5-star hotel. A vast dam and hydroelectric power plant were constructed just to ensure the lights were always on when the leader visited. An airport was built with a runway big enough for Concordes to take off from. To top it all off, on the edges of the expanding settlement, Mobutu built himself a palace, one nicknamed the Versailles of the jungle, a place stuffed with old master paintings and vintage French furniture, where he could escape the capital and sip pink champagne while listening to classical music. All the while, his already ravaged nation sank deeper and deeper into poverty. In this era, many referred to that nation as a rich country of poor people, alluding to its vast mineral wealth Mobutu personally siphoned off $5 billion from. But such thievery was only made possible by having friends in some very high places. Perhaps one of the most remarkable things about Mobutu was how open he was about his sins. In 1977, for example, he gave a speech nominally warning of the evils of corruption, but which effectively doubled as a kind of advert. "Everything is for sale," he declared. "Anything can be bought in our country." Again, this was dressed up as an anti-corruption speech, but those listening caught the high-pitched tones of the kleptocratic dog whistle. With Mobutu's nation rich in diamonds, copper, and cobalt, dozens of Western firms were more than happy to close their eyes to his abuses in return for buying up those resources. Who cared if their dollars flowed straight into the tyrant's pockets? After all, it's not like vastly more powerful actors weren't interested in backing Mobutu, actors with the wealth and technology of entire states at their disposal. By now, the 1960s had given way to the 1970s. What had once been the Democratic Republic of the Congo had been renamed Zaire by Mobutu, who had likewise renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko, Kuku, Ngbendu, waza, Banga. Or to give him the English version of his title, the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, will go from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. But while times may have changed, the Cold War was eternal. With communist influence always threatening to expand, Western powers were permanently on the lookout for bulwarks against Marxism. Who cared if those bulwarks were preposterous dictators who ate the finest foods while their countrymen starved? So it was that Mobutu was able to stay in everyone's good books, courted by Washington, Paris, and Brussels in return for stamping out the Soviet flame in Africa. Remarkably, this went well for the dictator, even when it went badly. In 1975, Zaire sent troops across the border into Angola to stop a left-wing militia from taking the capital. Only it turned out that left-wing militia had serious Cuban training and was able to wipe the floor with Mobutu's troops and then seize power. Yet even this debacle didn't dent his foreign support. When Katanga erupted in rebellion a couple of years later, French, Belgium, and Moroccan troops all came to his aid, backed up by American logistics. So long as he was anti-communist, Mobutu couldn't be allowed to fall. Which is remarkable when you consider just how uncapitalist so many of his policies were. 1973, for example, saw the advent of Zairianization, a fancy word for expropriation and nationalization of foreign-owned businesses. Unfortunately, it turns out that those foreigners, mostly Pakistani and Belgian, but Greek and Jewish too, were pretty good at business, while the cronies Mobutu handed their property over to weren't. The result was a general collapse of productivity, which in turn fed into the general economic malaise and sense of decline. A decline that couldn't be halted even with absurd stunts like Mobutu paying Muhammad Ali and George Foreman $5 million each to take part in Rumble in the Jungle in the renamed capital, Kinshasa. Come the 1980s, the one thing keeping the nation economically afloat was high copper prices. Prices high enough that Mobutu could pay off strong rivals and keep his cronies in relative luxury. Not that being a Mobutu crony was much fun. A man who'd like to dominate people, Mobutu was fond of sleeping with his underlings' wives, both to humiliate them and to show how powerful he was, how he could do anything, and you just have to smile and take it. But no matter how powerful he felt, no matter how many broadcasts from TV stations began with an image of him descending from the heavens, Mobutu was far from the strongest force in his nation. As the 1980s progressed, the twin impersonal forces of economics and history were going to bend his regime to breaking point. And when it finally snapped, it was going to take a whole lot of people down with it. Vladimir Putin infamously called the breakup of the Soviet Union a tragedy. But while most Georgians, Ukrainians, Estonians, and so on would probably disagree, it absolutely was a tragedy for one man in Africa. With the Cold War over, Mobutu Sese Seko suddenly found Western support for his regime drying up. The decade before, the collapse of copper prices and ballooning national debt had left Zaire effectively reliant on American and European aid. As long as Washington was still worried about the Soviet threat, that aid kept coming. But when the USSR collapsed, next, a whole bunch of officials began to ask themselves why they were throwing money at this corrupt despot. So, in the early 1990s, they stopped. In an effort to keep the money tap on, Mobutu tried introducing multi-party democracy, but when that resulted in a new prime minister that he didn't like, he suspended the guy after just 12 days. So, the West stopped financially backing him. With nothing else going for it, what remained of Zaire's economy bottomed out. In those dark days, inflation peaked at 7,000%. Deadly riots repeatedly swept the capital. Not that Mobutu really cared. As the country descended, the dictatorship retreated to the luxury of Gbadolite. There, he drank imported champagne and entertained wealthy guests, a bizarre male caricature of Marie Antoinette eating cake in the fake Versailles while everything went to hell. In the end, though, it wouldn't be turmoil in his own nation that toppled Mobutu, but a humanitarian disaster across the border. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwanda's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down over the capital, Kigali. An ethnic Hutu, Habyarimana was killed at a time of extreme tensions between the nation's Hutu majority and Tutsi minority. The very next day, Hutu extremists, aided by the government, began the systematic killing of Tutsis in what would become one of the 20th century's worst genocides. 800,000 people would be killed in just 100 days. In neighboring Zaire, the effects would be apocalyptic. Not that it looked like Rwanda was going to destabilize Mobutu's regime at first. Quite the opposite. As Rwanda exploded, former colonial powers like France were desperate for regional partners. Always ready to exploit a crisis, Mobutu opened Zaire to Paris, immediately turning himself back into a darling of the West, a status that only increased when he agreed to host over 1 million refugees. The trouble was, those refugees weren't persecuted Tutsis, but Hutus, including some Hutus who had helped direct the genocide. By July 4th, 1994, the Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front had fought its way into the capital and toppled the government. Fearing the coming backlash, many Hutus had fled to Zaire. Among them were militias who now use Mobutu's nation as a staging ground for attacks on the RPF. But while Mobutu may have been fine with cross-border raids, the RPF certainly weren't, and they would soon be more than happy to take matters into their own hands. Mobutu Sese Seko was in Switzerland seeking treatment for prostate cancer when he got the call. It was autumn of 1996 and the dictator was miserably ill. So advanced was his cancer that it had become incontinent, forcing him to wear diapers so he wouldn't soil himself. In another universe, it's all but certain the cancer would have ended Mobutu's rule, his grip on power only loosening when he finally died. But not in this universe. That day, Mobutu could only listen in horror as he heard the news that the RPF had crossed into Zaire. Worse, they were backing a brand new Zairian rebel group determined to oust him, a group receiving money and weapons from a coalition of African states that had wronged in the past. Hoping to inspire his army to fight for him, the old sick man returned home, preparing to face down the invaders. But when he got there, he found far too few people willing to lay down their lives for him. Over the following months, the rebels fought their way across the Congo's rivers and mountains, along isolated roads, through dense forests. By May 1997, they'd reached Kinshasa. Terrified, Mobutu did as he'd always done before, and he begged the West for help. This time, though, the West wasn't listening. On May the 16th, the dire Mobutu boarded his plane and fled into exile. In a sign of how bad things had become, his own officers took pot shots at the craft as it rose into the air, the bullets pinging off the hull. Yet the big humiliation would be Mobutu's inability to land. Initially heading for France, the plane was refused permission to enter European airspace, so Mobutu instead flew to Togo, whose own dictator he'd backed in the past. But he was allowed to stay there just a mere handful of days before Togo also ordered him to leave, and neither the CIA nor Belgian intelligence, who had clandestinely served, were willing to help him. In the end, the only nation that would accept him was Morocco. It was here, in a hospital in the city of Rabat, that Mobutu spent the last months of his life. A disgraced, cancer-ridden exile, unable to do anything as his palace was looted, as Zaire was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as his name was scrubbed from history. He didn't even get the bitter satisfaction of watching the nation descend into civil war without him. By the time the Second Congo War started, the dictator was no more. Mobutu Sese Seko died on September 7th, 1997, at the age of 66. He left behind a broken and financially broke nation, one with the mineral wealth to be staggeringly rich, but instead trapped in a quagmire of poverty and violence. And while a legacy of colonial exploitation certainly hadn't helped, Mobutu's reign had only made things 1,000 times worse. Today it's hard to truly grasp what an utter disaster Mobutu Sese Seko was. At independence, his nation had been wounded and ravaged, yes, but with a possible bright future ahead of it, one embodied in the fiery national pride of Patrice Lumumba. But Mobutu had helped strangle that future, killing Lumumba and seizing power, then plundering his nation with a greed as vast as it was self-defeating. It's rare in modern history to meet leaders who are unequivocally good or bad. A disastrous president might do great humanitarian work, or a venerated prime minister might tarnish his greatness with racism. Mobutu Sese Seko, though, falls into that special category of people who simply made the world a worse place, who offered nothing beyond narcissism and greed, and delivered both in abundance. We can only hope this will remain his epitaph for centuries to come.